We were not just abused, but we were abused and mistreated in the world because of our Africanity, our Africanness, our history. But we are the first people. The humanity begins on the continent of Africa. And so this, to me, is something that is extremely significant. And if we don't understand this, we don't understand why the urgency for a united Africa. Africa will never be what it ought to be without having a united Africa, without either a united federation, a United States of Africa, or a Africa with a powerful central government. At any rate, what we are clear is that Garvey understood this in the early part of the 20th century. Du Bois understood it. It was understood by Sylvester Williams. It was understood by Atenor Fierman, George Padmore, Anna Julia Cooper, Kwame Nkrumah, Sheikh Anta Diop, John Henry Clark. All of those ancestors are gone now, but it is upon their shoulders that we stand today and we launch again this incredible appeal. And let me tell you this, and please remember this. I don't for once think that we should begin any discussion about the unity of Africa, assuming that we haven't done anything. We have done a lot. There is a lot more to be done, but we certainly have done a lot. And Africa is moving inexorably toward this notion of a United States of Africa, even with the difficulties that I will point out today. The continent is massive. It is a huge continent. The 48 states, continental states of the United States of America, this is without Alaska and Hawaii, can be put inside Africa 4 times. That's how massive it is. In fact, Africa, the Sahara desert could swallow up the 48 states of the United States, just the Sahara alone. The population of Africa is nearly 2 billion. We normally say that they have counted 1.5 billion, but there are Africans, I'm sure, not counted. So about 2 billion people. The largest city in the world right now is not Sao Paulo. It's not Tokyo. It's not Mexico City. It is not even the other African city, Cairo, which used to be the largest city in the world. The most populous city in the world today is Lagos, Nigeria, with 29 million people. Think about that. That's like 3 times the size of the population of New York City. This is a massive, massive continent in terms of population, but yet a continent that is in many ways underpopulated as a result of the nearly 400 years of exploitation of the continent, the rape of the people, the kidnapping of the Africans that depopulated Africa and in a way distorted the growth pattern and path and the industrial development path of Africa as a continent. The largest desert in the world is the Sahara. It has that reputation. The longest river in the world is the Nile. We know that as a fact. The cleanest river in the world, the river in the world that has the least ammonia, the least industrial fertilizer and urban materials being dumped into it is the Congo, the mighty Congo, the cleanest river in the world. I write about this in my book. The History of Africa by Molefi Kete Asante, the third edition. So the third edition of my book has a lot of this in it, but it has also a lot of the background information. Africa has climates in the north and south that are mirror images of each other. And sometimes we don't realize this, that if you go to the Cape Town region, that climate in Cape Town is similar to the one that you would find in Algeria and Morocco. And if you go to the Savannah regions in the north, you would discover that the Savannah regions that you would run into in Burkina Faso and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are similar to the regions that you will run into in Zimbabwe and so on. And then, of course, you run into the rainforest region from both sides, whether you're coming from the north or from the south. But Africa is a rich continent. I'm telling you this to sort of give you the background why the uniting of Africa is extremely important. You have to have appreciation for the wealth of the continent. Just a few, I mean, that we can think of off the top of our head. There's uranium in Africa. There's gold in Africa. There are diamonds, hydroelectric energy. There's titanium, platinum, copper, bauxite, chromium. In fact, you could name maybe 20 other significant and important minerals that are used in the world, and you can say, wow, that's Africa. Many years ago, let's say 1980, 81, 82, I lived in Zimbabwe. I was in Zimbabwe. And even at that time, what I discovered was that the settlers who had come to Zimbabwe and who had engaged in struggle with the people of that land, particularly under the leadership of the great Nehanda. And they had struggled and fought to establish a foothold in that part of Africa. They knew agriculturally that it was a rich land. They knew in terms of their grazing that it was a great land for cattle and sheep and goats. So, but they didn't necessarily know at the time about the rich mineral deposits that were there from the beginning of the earth history. In fact, Zimbabwe may very well be, just as a nation of itself, which would be with the United Africa, just one state, the richest country in the world. You got granite masses there, which just pour out gold and diamonds. You have the Great Dike, which is 4 miles wide and about 300 miles long from north to south, which has so much of the world's gold and diamonds. In fact, 25% of all the diamonds in the world that we know of, deposits, are in Zimbabwe, one country, 25%. So when you ask yourself about these resources, you have to wonder, why is it then that the production, the jewelry production, the use of somehow these resources are managed in Israel, or managed in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and not managed in Africa? If you get 25%, and that's just Zimbabwe. I'm not talking about Namibia. I'm not talking about South Africa. These are other states with large productive communities of diamonds. Then the dominant chromium production in the world is in Zimbabwe. It's the second producer of platinum next to South Africa. And you got lithium, coal, antimony, petroleum now. They just discovered petroleum in Zimbabwe. It is the richest single nation in the world. But what you know is that it has had difficult problems not of its own making. And I will talk about that, while the urgency is essential that we have a United States of Africa, or a united Africa. The African diaspora is worldwide. And we have to give thanks to the African diaspora for raising these questions, more so than we do on the continent. On the continent, these questions are not raised very often. And if they're raised in these formal settings of the heads of state. And the heads of states never move. The heads of state never move on these issues in any real practical terms that the masses of people understand. But I guarantee you, when I speak on the continent of Africa, and I speak to the universities, and I speak to the students, and I speak to gatherings of people in community centers throughout the continent, they love to hear the possibility of Africa uniting, because they see the essential necessity of it. This is what the diaspora brings, the old diaspora. The old diaspora brings to the discussion of the unity of Africa, the idea that we are Africans. It is not so much that our particular ethnic group, African American or Jamaican or African Brazilian or Costa Rican, is the dominant factor. The dominant factor for us is that we are African people. And Africa itself, as a continent, ought to be a continent that is united. But because its diaspora is everywhere, in every continent of the world, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, in North America. I mean, from states like the United States, Mexico, Canada, Nicaragua. These are places where Black people are, African people. South America, you got Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Uruguay. You can go on, Argentina. African people are in these places. In the Caribbean, you got the countries of Haiti, Jamaica, you got Cuba, Puerto Rico, you got the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. I mean, Africans are everywhere in the diaspora. That's the old diaspora. Then, of course, you got the new diaspora, where people from these new nationalities after the 1950s are settled in Houston, Texas. You have a huge population of Yoruba people and Nigerians from other regions of Nigeria in Houston. It's a big city of those people. In Philadelphia, you got a huge population of Liberians. In Oakland, California, you got a huge population of Ethiopians, you see, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and all over the world, you can speak of these communities, the Ghanaian populations in London, for example, or in Germany, the Cameroonians. Africans are everywhere now. So this notion of a United States of Africa is not a foreign notion. It is a notion that is necessary, and it's something that we have to understand, but that there is a basis for it. There's a basis for a united Africa. We have a continent with a common landmass. Probably one of the most direct and discrete land masses for a continent is Africa. I mean, outside of Australia, you have the borders quite defined for the continent. You have a common continental history, not just in geographic terms, in terms of the Platonic, I mean, the various plates that have come in terms of tectonic structures and so on. You have it in terms of the history, continental history of the origin of humanity on the continent of Africa, and people spreading from the eastern part of Africa throughout the rest of the continent, and then finally into the rest of the world. You have the key generators of culture and civilization. the Sahara region, the Rift Valley region, the rainforest itself. These are key generators of human civilization. This is, before 70,000 years ago, everybody in the world was Black. And what generated those civilizations? The Rift Valley experiences, the Sahara, which has not always been a desert, for example, you see, and the rainforest. And then you have the international rivers of Africa, which cross all these little political borders that have been set up during the colonial period. The Nile River passes through different countries, not just one. The Congo, the Limpopo, and the Niger. These are developments. These are African developments that create, sometimes in a natural way, a common unity of the African people. But there are threats. I recognize it, and you recognize it. I mean, we're not. This is not an unknown thing to us about the threats to Africa. We understand the threats to the unity of Africa, neo-colonialist attitudes in Africa. This is one. Ruthless bilateralism is another one. The surrogate warfare in African states is another one. And the economic strangulation through sanctions. I'll come back to this, but let me just say, the neo-colonialist attitudes, those are the attitudes that are against the United States of Africa. We've fought against those attitudes. We've had to fight against those attitudes because for some people, in terms of their individual ambitions and wealth, and in terms of their alliances with the enemies of Africa, they don't want to see a united Africa. They want to see an Africa that is basically beholden either to the West or to the East. But it is the South that is emergent. And it is emergent because of the tremendous population explosion in Africa. The average age of the African is 19. The average age of the European, for example, is 48. So we have in Africa already this tremendous potential for an explosive growth and development that will be like something that we have never seen before. We have ruthless bilateralism, and this bilateralism has tried to tame Africa's development. And what do I mean by this? I mean that you have Western European countries and the United States of America and some other countries that are seeking to gain power, basically making agreements between themselves and individual African nations right now. That's going on. And the more we talked, and we have talked for many years about an active Pan-Africanism, which is different from the rhetoric of Pan-Africanism, which is different from declaring Pan-Africanism, because the declaration of Pan-Africanism and the rhetoric of Pan-Africanism will never bring you Pan-Africanism. The only way you will have an active Pan-Africanism is an ideology of Afrocentricity. That is where the best interest of Africa is the fundamental driving point for any discussion and any discourse on African unity. If you ask yourself the question, is this in the best interest of Africa? Whatever it is, if it's some other ideology, if it's some other application, if it's some other practice, even if it's a personal practice, the whole question you have to ask is, what is the driving, the animating force or ideological position that must be taken by African people everywhere, anywhere? That is the thing. And the fact of the matter is, We have rarely had an African nation to take the leadership for at least expressing the ideological position of Africa. Right now, if you ask the question, what African nation expresses the ideology of Africa? That gives us hope for the future of Africa. It would be very hard pressed for us to come up with an answer. Now, we could, if somebody said, well, what is the Asian example of an Asian idea? We can have 2 or 3 of them. People say, well, India. People say, well, China. People say, well, Japan. If we say Europe, who expresses Europe? We can say Germany. We can say UK. We can say the United States of America, or even Australia. But who represents Africa in its totality as a culture, as a civilization, as a way of thinking and viewing the world? So we don't get there with bilateralism, because bilateralism, what it gives us is a position where the so-called wealthy nations, which are mainly European and North American and Asian, basically dominate poor nations, and the African nations are poor. So if China makes an arrangement between China and Chad, obviously China is the dominant force. If the United States make an arrangement between itself and Niger, obviously the United States is the dominant force. And this, of course, is a power position. So this ruthless way of so-called partnering with Africa is not a partnership at all. It is a domination. And then the third one, the surrogate warfare in African states. Right now, in African states, you have wars going on. This is brought about largely in more contemporary terms by religious factions. That Black people have become more fanatical in the expression of foreign religions than we have in expression of our own religion. So basically what you got now is the Christians, a religion that was essentially promoted by Europe, and Islam, a religion that was essentially promoted by Arabs, using Africa as a lane for warfare. And you got these battles and going on between people on the continent of Africa that really are, these are surrogates. They're not like, it's not like, you know, you have somebody who's fighting in Africa who's claiming that, well, you know what, my particular religious expression of Africanity is stronger than yours, and I want to teach you mine so that you'll know mine. No, we're not fighting whether or not it's Yoruba or Zulu. We are fighting whether or not it's Islam or Christianity. And this is kind of strange, but it only demonstrates the degree to which our people, in effect, are subject to other ideas and nations other than our own idea. And that's a problem, the surrogate warfares in African states. I mean, in Sudan, you see it quite frankly, where it has come to the point where the people who basically run the economy are fighting against the darker skinned people in Sudan. This is one country. It's a country of my maternal origin. You got a situation where that's the issue. This whole struggle between who are these people? What creates this problem? The problem is created by the adherence to ideas that basically contradict our own historical ideas, so that you don't have people talking about Kush, for example, or Merowe, or Napata in Sudan. These are classical civilizations. These are civilizations before Islam. You don't have people talking about the Nile Valley complex, which includes Aksum in Ethiopia. You see, this is a strange thing, and the reason we don't have it is because we have a policy, or at least a principle, that we can accept anything else other than our own selves. And that creates a big, big threat to continental unity. And the last one is economic sanctions, strangulation through sanctions. That's why I use the example of Zimbabwe, not only because I lived there, my youngest son was born there, but also because if you think about the Zimbabwe situation, it's the richest country in the world, but yet it has some of the poorest people. This is not the doing of Africans. This is not the doing of African people. This was not the doing of Mugabe. And Mugabe was a brilliant leader. There's no question about it. He was not only a brilliant leader, but he was focused. He had been trained by Kwame Nkrumah. He understood precisely that the thrust of the European was to dominate Africans and to dominate Africa. And he said, on my watch, this will not happen. And what does that do for him? What did it do for him? It brought down the wrath of the Europeans. So they said, okay, well, we won't give you any medical supplies. Okay, we won't give you any banking access for your money. We're going to give you no military equipment for your armies. We're going to put an embargo against any nation that wants to sell to you, any European nation that wants to try to help you. We're going to attack them. We're going to put sanctions on them. So we're basically going to isolate you and squeeze you so that the people will revolt against you and you'll be kicked out of office because you won't allow us to come in and dominate. It's a strong people who's willing to suffer through all of that and to say, okay, put your sanctions, put your embargo, but we're going to keep our independence. But this is what happened to Zimbabwe. This was the thing. And of course, many of the people in Zimbabwe, I mean, if you become accustomed to a certain way of life, they say, well, you know, why are we suffering like this? We're suffering like this because Mugabe won't go along with the white people. He won't say to the white people, look, you okay, you can come in and take over our country like you once did. He said you can't do it. So what they do often is to discover or find in Africa other people who will fight these battles in the name of Europe or in the name of the US or in the name of China, so that you begin to get weakness. And of course, Zimbabwe was in a hard place. And that's one of the reasons why I think the Chinese have made such aggressive inroads into Africa, is because many of the nations said, you know what, I don't want to be dominated by Europe or the United States, so let me go to China. I mean, one of the things that Mugabe was famous for saying, they said, well, you know, we got a sanction on you. You can't come and shop in London. You can't shop in New York. We're not going to let you fly to those places. He said, well, okay, well, I'll go to Shanghai. I go to Beijing. There are other places in the world that are just as useful. If I need some specialized medical help, I'll go to other places. There are other places in the world. And I mean, in the discovery of that, of course, what we found out was that the Chinese were very willing to give $9 billion to the Congo for lease of their minerals. It was willing to give billions of dollars to the Ethiopians to build super trains and subways, so long as Ethiopia would also give or lease so much of its minerals for the next 100 years and so forth. So these are the problems that we have because we don't necessarily have a country, a large country, to defend our interests. If you look at the situation with the military, in Africa right now, the United States has 29 US military bases in Africa. Even most people in the United States don't know that. That if you look at the centerpiece of a network in the US, of the U.S. in Africa. It's around the Horn of Africa. It's around Somalia and that whole region where there are six. There's a drone base, but that drone base really controls 6 other drone bases throughout the continent of Africa. And what do America need drones in Africa for? For surveillance, for warfare if necessary. You don't have to send any troops. You can send weapons through drones. The drones can become weapons. You don't have to fight against African leaders that you don't like on the ground. You can do it from the air. So 29 bases outside of those 6 drone bases, 29 bases that the United States has in Africa. And I just want to say this because sometimes people don't realize the fact that there's some countries, of course, in Africa where there are no American military bases. They don't have any in Zimbabwe. At least they didn't last year. And they don't have any in South Africa. Nigeria doesn't have any, you see. But some of the countries that we do know, they do have bases, and foreign bases. And outside of the United States, you got Britain has a base in Kenya. Israel has a base in Eritrea. France has bases in Ivory Coast, Senegal, Chad, Niger, Gabon, and Djibouti, and Mali. China has a base in Djibouti. They have a military base in Djibouti. Turkey has one in Somalia. Japan has one in Djibouti. Italy has one in Djibouti and in Libya. The United Arab Emirates even has a base in Libya and in Somaliland and in Eritrea. That's all the control of the Red Sea, that whole Eritrea thing. Iran has a base in Eritrea. India has bases in Mozambique, Seychelles, Mauritius, Madagascar. Now you think about it. Eritrea has bases from Iran, bases from Israel, a base from United Arab Emirates. And these 3 regions, all the same, we're right there together. We're watching each other. But they're also watching the shipping lanes, and they're also watching Africa. Now, the only major industrialized country without bases is Russia. Russia has no military bases in Africa. But these bases in Africa are meant to control Africa. And this is why I always tell people the meaning of Muammar Gaddafi was that he was an example, or he wanted to be an example of the independence of Africa. And that became, of course, the flaw that the West saw in him. He articulated the dream of Kwame Nkrumah of a united Africa. And let me just say this, because there have been many discussions about the Garvey dream and the Nkrumah dream. And people have tried to put these 2 dreams in conflict. Garvey's notion of Black Africa and a united Africa for Africans at home and abroad idea was based on the fact that during the early part of the 20th century, what he saw was that everywhere around the world, Black people were being persecuted, whether you went to South America, Central America, I say Central America, North America, South, which is Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, where he went, whether he went to United States, Haiti, Jamaica, wherever you went, he saw conditions where Black people were always on the bottom. And he said that we need a Black nation, and we need a Black nation that would take in a global understanding of the Black world. That was Garvey's idea. Nkrumah's idea, particularly after the 1945 Manchester Congress of Pan-Africanists, his idea was based on the state system, so that when Ghana became independent, which was the third independent nation in Africa, actually, rather than the first, it was third because and then of course you already had two, Liberia and Ethiopia were already independent, but then you had in terms of independence, gaining independence, you had Egypt first, and then you had Sudan, and then you had Ghana. The reason that we don't call Sudan or Egypt the first in Africa, the reason people didn't, I mean, I do, the people that didn't do that was because they considered themselves, they declared themselves Arab republics. So that has always been a problem. That's a problem that we have to deal with in the United States of Africa. Nkrumah thought he could deal with it by incorporating the North and the South into the same polity, and you would have a United States of Africa that would include the whole continent. And I like that idea. And this is, I like that idea because I don't want to give up classical Africa, particularly the Nile River complex. And that's something that I have a very good friend, close friend, whom I've shared many good times with and talking, discussion. And his name is Chinweizu. He's a philosopher from Nigeria, a brilliant man. And Chinweizu and I have had disagreements over this. And yet I think the Nkrumah idea of a continental Africa is the one that Muammar Gaddafi was pushing, but I don't think he was pushing it for the idea of an Islamicized Africa. I never saw that in his writings. I saw him say that the Arabs are in Africa and they need to learn to be Africans. I saw that in his writings. And I heard him speak in 2004 and in 2005. So I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding about Gaddafi. There were many flaws that this man had, many things that we would consider to be unethical or immoral, or many things that we would say would show that there were mistakes that were made in his life and style. And I have good friends one special good friend, Kola, who knows him very well and knew him very well. But I think that there was these complications with him. I mean, he was in a small country, Libya, in terms of population, and yet he had surplus money. And he wanted to see an Africa that had its own bank. He wanted to see an Africa that had its own currency, its own federal government, its own satellite, which would not be controlled by the Europeans. And he wanted us to interrogate Africa's own traditions and leadership traditions, and wanted Africans not to abandon African culture. If you go back and you read the Green Book, you understand that what he says, what he claims, is that the next era would be the era of Africa. And African people have to step up and step to the front and do their work, assert their own unity and so forth. This was Gaddafi's view. Whether or not he had come out of a Islamic background is not questionable. He had come out of an Islamic background. But I think his travels throughout the continent made him see how immense and tremendous the population was, and the growth of Africa itself, where you have, as I said, nearly 2 billion people. Yes, there are maybe 100 million Arab people or more in Africa, and there may be 10 million white people in Africa. But you have nearly 2 billion people on the continent. There's no reason for Africans to fear that the continent will be anything in the future except black, and in terms of its orientation. But it cannot be black just in color. The blackness cannot be a color. It has to be cultural and ideological. And I think Gaddafi understood a lot of that. And in fact, he was assassinated in October the 20th, 2011, mainly because of this. So I'm going to close soon, but let me just say this. We have to know where we are in the process. The AU came into being as an idea in 1999 in Sirte, Libya. And then, of course, the AU comes into being in South Africa in 2002. And at that time, when you start thinking about it coming into being, the organization established COMISA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. It established all kinds of regional organizations, East African Community, the Sahel, Saharan states, the Economic Community of Central African States, West African States, Southern African States, and the Arab Maghreb Union. These were organizations that were meant to set in motion the idea of an African unity. But first of all, they said, some of the people said, we had to do a regional thing. And that's where the regional thing comes in. But there are achievements. They've decided, they did decide, AU decided, that there should be several languages, Kiswahili, Spanish, French, English, and Arabic as the common languages of Africa. And any local African language should be encouraged. There is an African Investment Bank. There's visa-free travel now between different places in Africa. There's also high-speed rail connectivity, which is going on. They're building railroads that will connect capital to cities, and air transport networks that were being built before the COVID-19, where you would have the connectivity of the great cities of Africa in one single air transport network. There's an African Academy of Languages to study and explore the comparative nature of African languages, and also the origin of African languages, particularly with reference to classical African languages in the Nile Valley. And then there is a Pan-African Parliament with 265 elected members right now. It meets in Midrand, outside of Johannesburg. People in the diaspora and the diaspora sometimes don't know about that. They have no understanding that we have this Pan-African Parliament. And we have an Assembly of the African Union Secretariat, and the Court of Justice of the African Union. So these are achievements, but they're not the only things that have to happen. There has to be some relationship to the African diaspora, the old African diaspora, because sometimes when the African Union talks about the African diaspora, it is not talking about the old diaspora. It's talking about the Nigerians who no longer live in Nigeria. That's a recent diaspora, the ones who, after the independence of Nigeria, have spread to the rest of the world. They want that money to come back to Nigeria. The same is true with Kenyans, the same is true with South Africans, and so forth and so on. They're looking for their diaspora to aid and assist their local communities and their local states. The old diaspora wants to actually support all of Africa. And so this African powerhouse that I'm thinking of would be one of the richest nations on the globe if it came into being. It would not be a nation that would be poor. Right now, about 14 nations in Africa are among the poorest in the world. But if you had a nation that was connected in the United States of Africa, it would be in the top 3 or 4 nations in the world in terms of wealth and potential. You would have a streamlined military force. You wouldn't have 55 nations with their own military forces. You would have one, and that one would represent the entire state of Africa, you see. You would have one passport. Your passport would just simply say Africa. And the fishing industry would would blossom around the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans, and the great rivers of Africa, which cross now boundaries. But the Nile and the Congo would be the Nile, the Congo, the Niger, particularly the Niger and the Congo, or rather the Niger and the Nile, would be in one country. I mean, one country, because Africa is just one. It would be one nation. It would be a mighty people speaking with one voice. Strong agriculture, strong hydroelectronic power. Um, it would rejoin the old African diaspora and give any person living in Brazil or in Uruguay or Paraguay as an African person wanting to be identified with the African nation, would give them citizenship. If you lived in Canada or the United States and you said, oh, you know what, I want to claim my African citizenship, a progressive powerhouse, African powerhouse as a nation would say, yes, this is your birthright. You have this from history and from what happened to you through the 400 years of what Marema Ani calls the Ma'afa. So that is what we're looking for, you see. But we also have to have an Afrocentric ideology in economics and social organization. This is where mind comes in. This is where, to bring about this African situation, you're going to have people who, first of all, have a clear consciousness about African history and culture, and also can recognize that the concept of state sovereignty, which has been handed to us by Europe, is not necessarily the best concept for how you structure societies. Given all of the traditional politics in Africa and the ways that Africans have managed societies for thousands of years, this notion that a particular boundary or border is somehow sacred has to be questioned by Africans creating a United States of Africa. Right now, we have the international interference from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is being built on the Athabari, on the Blue Nile River, rather, on the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile River, the Abe River. The Abe River is a mighty river in Ethiopia. I've been on that river. I've seen that river, at least from Lake Tano. It's a very interesting thing to know now that what the Americans and the Chinese working together with Egypt are trying to do, because they're trying to say that Ethiopia shouldn't build this dam for Ethiopia's own interest. But we don't have a United States of Africa now. So you got people who are taking advantage of a concept that we have a United States of Africa, which we don't, and saying to Ethiopia, you can't do what you need to do for your own people. If we had a United States of Africa, this would be no interference. There'd be no issue between Egypt and Ethiopia. But there's only that issue because Egypt is saying, well, if you build the dam, it's going to not give us as much water as we've been having. But if Egypt and Ethiopia were in the same country, this would be no issue. We got these challenges. We got to deal with them. Ethnic chauvinism, regionalism, people fighting with each other because of you're not from my same ethnic group and so forth. Africa can overcome this, where the ideological position dominates all ethnicity and all chauvinism, and where patriarchy itself is shown to be problematic, where hierarchy is shown to be problematic, where we accept and appreciate the kind of openness that Esther Malangu has in terms of her own art. That we open our arms to each other, to the world. This is what we have to do. We have to read and study and explore our traditional histories and not have economic envy and migration distrust. These are the principles I think that are necessary. There's much more to say, and I guarantee you in the future, I will say these things because, you know, as a person who has devoted much of my life, most of my life, to trying to raise the consciousness of African people, I am seeking to bring us to the point where we see that it is not only essential and correct for us to be one and to work toward unity, but that this global Africanness, the one that Garvey talked about, and the one that Nkrumah envisioned, even when he talked about the continental African state, he certainly, by living in the diaspora, understood the interrelationship of all of these possibilities. But let us bring this through a sense of our knowledge and a sense of our spirit. Ashe. I say Ashe, which is a Yoruba term, which expresses actually my paternal side of my DNA family, which is both Nigerian and Sudanese. But of course, as you know, I carry proudly an Akan name and a Suto name, Molefi Kete Asante.